Hello, everyone. We are going to be doing a presentation called Invisibly Invisible, a review of sex education disparities for LGBTQIA plus and Latino transition age disabled youth. First, we're going to start with our positionality. I'd like to introduce Ricky. Please take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ricky. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a cisgendered male who identifies as being gay. I'll describe a little bit about what I look like. So I have red hair, glasses. I'm wearing a black polo shirt with a gold chain and a floral jacket on top. I'm coming from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I'm a second year PhD student, getting a degree in special education with a focus on the transition out of high school to work for disabled youth. And I'm coming here today with Elaine because we share a passionate interest in sex education and sexuality education. My side comes from more of that LGBT positionality and intersection, and then also the transition to work too, and how all of that intersects with that. So I'm excited to be here and for you all to listen to this. Elaine?
My name is Elaine, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm going to go ahead and describe myself. I've got long brown hair, brown eyes. I am wearing a cream colored shirt. I have brown skin. And so I also attend the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, first year doc student. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst. And I have a lot of my positionality, specifically being a Latina. I have a lot of interest in Latino families with transitional age youth, disabled youth as well. And being a Latina, coming from a family where sex education is very limited and a very conservative family, I have a lot of interest exploring this topic. In addition, I worked with many Latino disabled youth and their families, and I experienced a lot of resistance to sex education. And so I want to explore that topic a bit more as now as a doc student. And so, Ricky, I'm so glad that we can do this together because I think we have a lot of shared interests.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
So next, we're going to go over.
We're going to go over a few terms. Really quick before we go into these terms, I just wanted to put a little disclaimer out there that Elaine and I come from kind of a background and a culture where it's a lot of person first language. And that's kind of like how we were taught and like what we utilize. However, we know that that's not always common in all different spaces. And so from talking to the presenters and the organizers of SEXABA, we want to be conscious and respectful of that. So we are using identity first language, such as disabled youth. If we slip up, we will catch ourselves. We apologize for that. Just wanting to put that out there. Some other terms that we're defining, because as we will talk about, these terms are universally defined within the literature and within practice. So by sexuality, we're meaning the part of who we are as humans, our basic needs and aspects that can't be separated from basic human life. The sexuality is not synonymous with sexual intercourse. When we talk about sex, or when we mention sex, we're not merely talking about the physical act, but rather the culmination of social interactions between people, intimacy between people. Sex can also mean just gender identity, for example. And then when we're talking about sexual education, we're talking about the lifelong process that encompasses all these things that we just talked about: the biological aspects of sex, the social cultural aspects of sex, the psychological aspects of sex, things of that nature. ABA, we put onto here because sex education, as we will talk about, has been and currently sometimes still is a very reactive process. And sometimes ABA can be seen in some circles as well as being a very reactive behavior reduction process. And the way that we're talking about it today is wanting to teach skills and uplift people and utilize the science of behavior to teach sex education and be preventative and provide disabled youth with this information. Elaine, I'm going to pass it on to you now.
Just to piggyback up what you said about ABA and we wanting us to create or develop a more proactive and more friendly, more positive access for disabled transition age youth. I think that is our biggest want and desire here is what we're trying to accomplish. I want to go over three particular terms, two of them which are on this slide: Latino, or a few of them: Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, and Latina. for anyone who is going into higher education or is getting familiar with these terms. They were very complex for me to understand, but I'm going to attempt to share my understanding with you for these terms. Hispanic, I'm defining it as someone from a Spanish speaking region. And Latino, I'm defining it as a term designed to address a large, diverse group of people and those of Latino American descent. And Latinx, which was meant to be an inclusive term that considers transgender and those who don't identify with any gender binary. And it's been used as an alternative to feminine or masculine terms, such as Latino or Latina, but Latinx cannot be conjugated in Spanish. And in my experience, it's typically used in higher academic writing for what I've observed. And the last term, Latine, which I will be speaking about, has been designed to work with the Spanish language, a term used to reference non-binary people. So Latine, there may be some intersectionality with LGBTQIA plus individuals using Latine as a descriptor, which is great. So yeah, I guess that's
Perfect.
all right. Four key points that Ricky and I both want to share with you guys and like our outcomes to be. One is understanding the importance of the sex education for disabled youth. Two, understanding the gaps that exist in research and practice providing sex education to disabled youth. Three, understanding the importance of intersection of sex education, disability, and Latino and LGBTQIA cultures. Finally, resources and future research and practice.
All right. So first, we're going to, like Elaine said, talk about sex education for disabled youth. So historically, the civil rights movement of disabled individuals has made some great progress, such as the Individuals of the Education Act and providing free and appropriate education, or whether it be the Rehabilitation Act or the Workforce and Innovation Act to make sure that employers are not discriminating against disabled individuals, and that disabled youth are being provided the education they need to be able to transition to work or various aspects outside of high school. However, even though there has been much progress in all of these aspects, there still needs to be a lot more progress in providing the proper education and support to these individuals when it regards basic human needs and functioning, and specifically, like we're going to be talking about today, sex and sexuality. Now, having a lack of knowledge of sex education, of sexuality, of ourselves is not a causation of having a disability, but rather it's a lack of education and support from providers to these individuals. So it's really a disservice at that point. However, because there's a lack of education and support, disabled youth and disabled individuals are at a greater risk of sexual abuse, exploitation, just increased vulnerability. Research states that autistic individuals are reported to have higher levels of sexual victimization. And there's a lack of research that also looks into the sexual abuse of disabled youth. There's also a few more barriers as well that we wanted to mention with all of this. And a lot has to do with really society's view of sex education and sexuality for disabled individuals, such as society kind of sees sexuality of individuals with disabilities as being deviant. There's a lack of teacher education programs that focus on this topic. There's a lack of teacher knowledge and confidence, parent anxiety and fear, lack of valid and reliable sex health education, federal funding designed for disabled students to be provided comprehensive sex education.
And I've experienced as well in the research that I have found that parents' perceptions of their children, of their disabled children, impact their access to sex education. Some of the research said that parents did not expose their children to certain sex education topics because they never thought their child would reach that milestone, such as getting married or having intercourse. In addition to what you said about parents' anxiety and fear and sexuality being described as deviant, is that parents have this fear regarding their child, even though their child may be age and developmentally engaging or having urges that are of typical age level. Like, a typical 16-year-old with caught masturbating would be more normal than a 16-year-old a disabled 16-year-old also doing the same act, that would be seen more at deviant, even though they're the same age. And that's strange.
Yeah. And I think it's this, like you were saying, Elaine, it's this society view and this lack of education really for society and professionals, which is causing a lot of this problem. And so going into this professionalism, like we talked about before, sex education and sexuality education for disabled youth has historically been more of a reactive process, or if a problem arises, then we're going to take care of it. But the problem with this, especially as behavior analysts, like we know the problem with this is that just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. And there's only a problem because we're looking at it this way. And now if we look at this framework as sexual education being deviant for disabled youth, but then we put another aspect on top of it of a cultural context, LGBT or Latino like youth, then we're seeing even more problems potentially arise.
Yes. Yes. Agreed.
So, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Elaine.
No, no, that's why. I mean, this is even a bigger issue, which is why we both have interest in exploring why this is, or what is the review of current research that support these two groups.
Mhm.
There is much.
So, yes, like Elaine was saying, there isn't much. So, going more global before we get into the specific groups of individuals, there's a lack of research, like we said, in knowledge and understanding of sex education and sexuality education for disabled youth. And again, a lack of knowledge is not a causation of having a disability. It's a causation of us as professionals not having the education to support these individuals. Now, there is information out there, and we will get to this at the very end, but the information out there that exists for sex education and sexual education for disabled youth is still lacking. And is it in the right direction? Are we providing professionals with the right education and resources? Are they appropriate for certain minority groups as well? So there's lots of things to consider and to note, which is why we started defining a lot of these terms, is because in a lot of these resources and research and practice is these terms aren't fully defined. One person might think of sex education as the act of sex, and that's why it's a very no-no, when really we're talking about the biological aspects and sexual identity and things of that nature. And research needs to exactly. Hygiene. There are so many different aspects, the social aspect of it as well. And research also needs to address gender differences and in addition to cultural differences and how this kind of all comes to play. As you can see, it's very messy and we're just kind of skimming the surface for you all today. Sorry, this message keeps popping up at the top. I'm just going to click on. Okay. So, like we said, we started off with this more global aspect of research and practice and what we mean by sex education for disabled youth. But now we want to get more specific and first talk about this intersection of sex education, disability, and LGBTQIA cultures. So, among specific populations of disabled students who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or questioning, the effects of victimization, of sexual victimization, is increases. This population is even more vulnerable potentially because they're not receiving the proper education and support due to belonging to this community as well as having a disability. A lot of the research within this area focuses on understanding the risks in society and protective factors such as school level interventions, what staff can do to prevent this victimization, but a lot far of sexual abuse, but far less research concerns looking at this population for students of LGBTQIA backgrounds as well. And because there is such a lack of research in this area, we then have professionals that are working with individuals, disabled individuals who also belong to this community, and these professionals might be heterosexual working. And research has stated that there's some reluctancy in working on certain problems that may arise or providing this education because they don't necessarily belong to this community, but they're working with these individuals and with these students who do identify as being gay, for example. So that begs kind of a question that Elaine and I have talked about in the past is, do we need to have professionals then who identify within this community of LGBTQIA working with these disabled students because at least they can share some sort of connection with them?
Yes, yes. And there's also research, like specifically for Latinos, Maya et al. had mentioned that Latinos, there's not a lot of representation in research for Latinos, and that we need more Latinos doing Latino research on their population.
Mhm.
That's all I wanted to say.
No, no, and I think that's it. It brings up a really interesting point because I think that we need to provide education and support and professional development to professionals of all different ethnicities, of cultures, of backgrounds to work with a vast variety of people. So that, for example, I could work with someone who is Latino, and then Elaine, you could work with a disabled individual who identifies as being gay. But at the same point, we bring up a good point that like we're coming in with a very different bias in it. As long as, yes, we need to put the bias behind the door, but sometimes, I mean, it does kind of creep in there a little bit. And especially if research and practice state that these professionals and these teachers or whoever, they don't have the support to work with these individuals, then what happens?
And as a practitioner, I would say ethically it's my responsibility to understand where my clients are coming from or the groups that they come from. So if I was working with someone in LGBTQIA plus group, I want to understand what is culturally acceptable for them.
Yeah. Two more points that I wanted to make with this intersection here is, in my opinion, the education and support that we provide is even more important because of the effects within our society and within the culture of the LGBTQIA communities. So I've seen research, I've looked at myself coming out and coming to terms with who I am, that as a gay man, there's a certain look of what you should kind of identify as. And we see that in media all the time, in pictures, on dating apps now, and so on and so forth. So if you have a disabled youth who it does not have that support or education who is going into these communities, they could possibly feel even more isolated. But there's also research kind of back up that these like groups of individuals potentially are not as accepting of disabled youth as maybe we would think that they are coming from a more marginalized group. So I think again, there needs to be more education and support to these communities, and providing that support of the circle of acceptance. And I think it's a good kind of realization that like media and things of that nature. I'm going to butcher the name of the show. That's why I'm not even going to say it. But there's a show on Netflix, and he's the writer and the director as well as he's the main star. But he has cerebral palsy, and he identifies as a gay man, and he's a gay man in real life and has cerebral palsy. But that's perfect representation that we need to have more of. Maybe what is not the stereotypical what we like a gay man, which if you go and look it up on Google, I'm sure you'll see with the six-pack abs and so on and so forth. And that is not the reality. Trust me, it's not the reality.
And all of these other groups that are also depicted in TV, like all of these shows that are specifically on like Latino families, or even the shows that are focused on someone disabled person.
Hmm.
We think about autism specifically. There's a bunch of shows that are out now, with actors depicting that they're autistic. So I can see how all of these media images
Hmm.
be suggested.
Right. Yeah. And I do have to say, with all that being said, if we were to talk about this 10 years ago, there would be nothing in the media. So there is progress, but there's always things to learn and to move on from. And the last thing I'm going to mention, and then we're going to move on to the next slide, is looking more kind of at the clinical side of things. And we talked about this a little bit of like you as a professional working with these individuals, is that if we look at culture, and Elaine is going to talk about this a little bit later, is that if you work with a Latino client, for example, let's say, they're most likely going to be a part of a Latino family. So they all share the same cultural views, points, that representation is there. Now, if you work with an LGBTQ youth client, most likely they're going to be in a family of a heterosexual couple, and they might be the only person that identifies within this culture. So now you're working with someone who is in a family dynamic that doesn't have any like connection and cultural connection with their family. So it might even be even more imperative to make sure that their professional working with them maybe does belong to that. Because then if you throw another heterosexual BCBA, let's say, into the mix, what representation do they have? What kind of role model do they have? Or someone who really identifies with them and knows what they're going through, and instead of just trying to learn through that. So I think that is something also to consider with this.
Yes, yes. I'm not sure what the term is, but like a broker, being a broker,
Yes.
being part of that specific group and working with your other individuals who are also from that group, there are a lot of benefits to that.
Hmm.
And so being a broker between a family and a child or a young adolescent, how do I come out? I can only imagine these are just some of the questions I have, but like, how do I come out to my family? Or, how did you come out to your family? How can I take your experience, you take your experience as part of this group and share it with someone who is about to do the same thing.
Hmm.
I see it as a really beautiful moment, but not everyone gets that.
Right.
Not everyone gets that same opportunity.
Hmm.
That's all I want to say about that.
Okay. So, all right. So then, and the last thing I kind of wanted to now transition into is this intersection of sex education, LGBTQI disabled youth, and this transition to work, because I have this very big interest and my research and focus is on the transition to work. I wanted to kind of see how this was all meshing together because I felt like there was a connection. So, and one of the quotes that I have on here is the strongest predictor of positive outcomes for LGBTQ youth, disabled youth, is having supportive educators in their lives, which kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, is not only having the education to support these individuals, but then that support of this transition to work as well. So stepping back globally a little bit, current statistics from the National Longitudinal Transition Study indicate that there's limited progress in employing culturally and linguistically diverse students with disabilities. Black youth with disabilities have yielded an unemployment rate of 56%, whereas Hispanic youth, disabled youth, have an unemployment rate of 54%, which is notably higher than their white counterparts. However, within this group, individuals within the LGBTQIA community are not necessarily being represented. So, although there's been tremendous progress towards including culturally and linguistically diverse students within different transition policies and planning and assessments, we're ignoring some of maybe the unique needs that LGBTQ youth and their families may also need. However, there's little known and there's little research out there about this intersection and how sexuality and gender identity and disabled youth that fit into this group kind of navigate this career development, because career development is such a huge part of who we are, and work also is very different within many different cultures. So there's also the intersection with Latino communities as well, and that's something that I can't speak to necessarily, but that some cultures might really see work as the end all be all, that like, yes, that is what you need to do. Or maybe it's like you're not living to work, you work to live, or they don't see certain genders as working versus others. So there's that navigation of this career development and this career identity that you have and that a disabled youth may have. But then also you add into this extra component into there where there's society issues, there's that social component. Work for a lot of people creates this network. I mean, I treat this PhD as a job, and that's how Elaine and I have connected. You create this social network in this capacity, and disabled youth and disabled individuals deserve the same thing when they're transitioning into work and becoming employed. But then you throw on top of that, then being within the LGBTQIA community, and there might be some more barriers, such as disabled individuals need to be able to disclose their disability to receive certain accommodations. Do they also need to disclose that they belong to the LGBTQ community? Or are they going to be discriminated against from their peers, but that's not protected necessarily against for them in laws? So,
Is this group also being positively are the people surrounding this group positively promoting, hey, you can disclose this to your employer. You don't have to be afraid. Like, I disclose it, or people in my group disclose it this way. You may want to do this. Like, who is supporting that as well? Right?
and,
There's just so many layers.
I mean, disclosure, regardless of the context that we're talking about, is it's a very interesting thing that we need to teach as well to disabled youth. And this kind of brings in this sexuality component to it, because for me, I don't identify as having a disability, but when I started my first job, I didn't, it took me a while to disclose that I was gay. And because there are situations that like you can be discriminated against because of it. So having a disability on top of that, I can see that education and support needed by professionals to support those individuals is crucial. And then the last thing, I mean, there has been some studies out there that have looked at gender differences with career identities and kind of calls to action of how we can expand this field of transition to work in transition planning and transition assessments too, to make sure that they're not only culturally appropriate for individuals that we're working with, but also gender appropriate as well, based off of the individuals that we're working with. So there's a whole line of research and practice that needs to be had within this, but there is a huge intersection with all of these pieces, and it's kind of we're right on the cliff of figuring all this out. So I just wanted to share.
All right. Are we moving on to
Yes.
intersection of sex education, disability, and the Latino culture? Now, this one was something I had a lot of interest in due to my positionality, but also when I was looking into more research surrounding this intersectionality, there is really limited research out there for this particular group that I identified being a part of. Although I don't have a disability, I am very passionate about the specific group as I've worked as a BCBA with many Latino families with disabled youth. And it's been a constant issue of sex education. Is it okay? Is it appropriate? Or no, we don't want it. Or yes, we do want it. Or I don't know how to give it as a parent. Please help me. How do I do this? I haven't had an autistic child before, and I have to teach this. The views are very different, and I don't think I realized how different until I started digging into the research.
Mhm.
So today, there's only a few evidence-based interventions that have been culturally adapted for Latino families with disabled youth. I'm focusing specifically on autistic youth because there needs to be more evidence-based practice, more research for this group so we can be culturally competent and culturally accepting of this type of education, sexual education for Latinos. Being Latino, coming from a very conservative family, this is something I didn't get from my parents. This is something I didn't get. So I can understand, and in my experience working with this population, that they also didn't get that. Or parents were against the teaching of it. I think for multiple reasons. So because research was very lacking, I'd have to take research that was focused on sex education and Latinos, which there are some, and I'd have to take research surrounding sex education and disability or sex education and autism, which there were some, and try to make some synthesize what this might mean for Latinos, disabled youth.
Mhm.
Yes. So, what else I want to say? There has been research stating that there are multiple barriers for this group that has both of these intersect or identifies in both of these groups, specifically disabled or with autism and Latinos. So, like I'm focusing on autism and Latinos, that there are different views as far as Latino families and language and citizenship concerns and inadequate family dynamics and school partnerships, cultural awareness or lacking thereof, and limited resources, biased professional attitude, biased family attitudes.
Mhm.
All of these different perceptions that people have disabled individuals definitely impacts disabled person's outcomes. And so overall, the body of research regarding Latino families with disabled youth there's evidence that states there needs to be a lot of adaptation that needs to happen. There are sex education curriculums. There are suggestions to how we can be delivering this information. However, it is not adapted, as you said, Ricky, culturally adapted to meet the acceptance of this group, which is why I believe, which we are still lacking in the exploration of. And I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it there before I move on. As far as what else I want to say regarding the intersection. So there's a lot of synthesizing that still needs to be done. And I'm not saying I'm the only one who knows how to do it, but I'm trying to figure it out so we can, I don't know, develop something, understand what is significant to a Latino families with a disabled youth, what is significant to Latino disabled youth? Those are the questions I want to be asking. Okay, so some reported disparities for Latinos. I'm going to mention based on the research that I have seen. Historically, Latinos have met a lot of health related disparities. For example, Latinos searching for potentially autism diagnosis are diagnosed later than their white counterparts. Why is that? There's also other research that suggests that that doctors have historically overseen Latino concerns, which is a disparity in itself.
Mhm.
So those are just two contributing disparities I'm reporting. There's also very little research done for this particular group, specifically into adulthood. There, to my knowledge, there isn't any studies that are focusing on Latino disabled transition age youth.
Mhm.
And imagine if we had some tailored, adapted curriculum that might be accepted to the families and the individuals themselves.
And going off that really quick is that there's starting to be words. There's slowly starting to be more research on cultural humility and like cultural brokerage and things of that nature within this transition to work or transition out of high school for culturally and linguistically diverse student disabled youth. However, a lot of it does not focus on this sex education component to it. And I feel like we can take a lot of that research that is being done and incorporate that to it. Because like we said, within this transition to work, there is a sexuality component to it, whether it be the social aspect, let alone that. I mean, that's super important is that are we making sure that these individuals are set up so that they know if they're being sexually harassed at work or to make sure that they're given the skills to not sexually harass and be able to have like social relationships at work and whatnot. And so I think we need to, there is a huge kind of black hole that we need to start filling.
Yes. And specifically for Latino families and some of the intersectionality as well and the disparities, there's not enough research from the individuals themselves. We need to be doing research on disabled Latinos
Yes.
and what they want and what is important to them and what has been disparities for them. One of the studies that I looked at that was 90% Latino age youth, the challenges reported by these individuals were parent disapproval, stigma, embarrassment, privacy, confidentiality, and fear. And being from this group, being a Latina, I definitely had experienced all those. And although this particular study did not focus on disabled youth, I'm curious to know if disabled youth also would identify these key concepts, these key barriers to also be a barrier when they're also from a Latino family.
I think it's important. I'm going to echo off what you said, Blaine, is that a lot of the research, I mean, in both of these kind of contexts of what we're both talking about, is that we're asking professionals or we're asking families or teachers, or we're looking at assessment tools or whatever, what have you. Very little research is specifically working with the disabled youth and asking them exactly what they're living with and exactly what they're going through. And I think we need to do a lot more of that, or more of the research that does kind of focus on that, like giving them the voice is for disabled youth that maybe are more high prevalence disability categories versus disabled youth that are from more low incidence disability categories who might need more often extensive and unique support needs.
Sports.
Exactly. We're giving more of the voice to the families, to the professionals, and we're not providing them the education and support to give them the voices. And there's even more of a huge red flag and barrier there of someone maybe who is non-vocally verbal, who might want to identify within the LGBTQIA community, or is it transitioning to work as Latino, or just learning about sex education and health in general. There's a lot more of, oh no, we don't need to do this, it's not a problem, sort of thing, coming from families and professionals. And that's a huge problem.
Definitely. I completely agree, especially for that specific group when we're talking about, needing high support needs. How do we support families and parents to identify what may be significant for their, cultural group and their beliefs and how we can promote access for their adolescent children, in a preventative manner
Yeah.
versus a reactive manner. But we got to start them young, adolescents. I know when we're talking about youth, we're talking about ages 14 to 21. But, as a professional, I think about preparation when I historically for the populations I work with earlier at 11, whether that's an introduction or some small concept within sexual education, like hygiene,
Mm.
right? 11-year-olds are starting to menstruate much younger, not even 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
8 years old, and parents wanting to say, no, I don't want you to teach that to my child. They're too young. And I'm saying, hey, they're showing this sex education readiness. Our bodies change. And so this would be a great concept to learn, right? How to wear a pad, change your underwear. I'm sure the same thing for males too.
Yeah.
We have to be able to advocate, I would say, too, for groups of individuals who are needing more support, needing our advocacy. And then before you know it, then I'm getting told, hey, Lee, my child started they started menstruating. What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just, we could have been preventative. And I think that's just one personal experience I've had where we have to be reactive. And it's a scary thing for, it's a scary thing for anyone, but going through this as a female. So imagine if you these concepts are not clear, they're withheld from you for some reason because your parent has a perception that you will not understand this concept, or maybe doesn't know how to explain this concept using their child's strengths. If they're strong visual learner, use visual.
Mm-hmm.
Strong auditory learners, stories. There's so many ways that we can adapt, not only for Latinos and LGBTQIA plus, but also, disabled as well. Like, how can we include all those nuances together that helps promote, better sexual outcomes?
Yeah. I think that it's a good transition almost into some of the resources that we put on here because, as you were saying, Elaine, there are resources out there, and everyone should be able to have access to these slides and stuff and can click the links to go to these various sources that are out there. And this is only just a handful of things that do exist. But are they like, at what age are we starting this off at? Like, just in my lens of transition to work, I've been in many situations where it's like, hey, like we have this 20-year-old, let's start teaching them to be work ready and interview skills. And we're like, whoa, that should have happened at 14, if not earlier. And so like a lot of with sex education and sexuality too, how can we start this earlier, especially for these different groups? And maybe that's the materials that we have, like the books that we're presenting to students and stuff. It's maybe not just a heterosexual couple, but it's like multiple types of families, skin color, backgrounds, things of that nature. So what we want to focus on, and what we're going to transition out of the slide pretty quickly, is not that there does need to be more resources specifically for this population and assessments and so on and so forth. But we want to kind of talk about the stuff that is out there and how, as professionals, we can take this aspect of cultural adaptation to them.
Yes. Are we there in slide 11?
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk about why. And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, but I want to take what et al. Has already done and kind of just share it with everyone. This is relatively new, 2020, where the focus was on cultural adaptation. So why is cultural adaptation important? Although there is some evidence-based practice, there's a need to ensure that interventions are culturally tuned and linguistically attuned, meaning that the language used to describe terms within sexual education, and I'm adapting this cultural adaptation to this sexual education. This research was not necessarily adapted to sexual education. This research was focused just on cultural adaptation. So I'm taking sex education in my Latino background and how we can culturally adapt sex education for Latinos with their families, their disabled youth. How can we adapt?
Mhm.
And so Kuhn had mentioned that there are a bunch of different steps that we can take to culturally adapt. Also, when curriculum is adapted, it is research has suggested that the outcomes are more effective than with material that is not culturally adapted. It speaks for itself. We need to be doing more cultural adaptation. So yes, more effective. And how do we do the cultural adaptation for something, for some curriculum, etc.? We can systematically combine, there's a systematic placeholder step. Here we go. We have like identifying the needs and interests. So we talk to whatever group, maybe LGBTQIA plus, and we figure out what are the concerns, what are the interests of this group, right? Maybe surrounding sex education. And then we talk about the community partnership building. We take people from these groups, maybe Latinos who are interested in sex education, maybe LGBTQIA who are also interested in this, and we use them as brokers to kind of partnership a relationship with this.
Mm.
And we also take the literature that is available, kind of what you were saying, Ricky. There are a bunch of little literature gaps, but they're not all necessarily adapted for these two groups that we're specifically talking about today. So what research is out there and how can we use it to be most effective? And then we translate, adapt, and create an initial curriculum. So translating some of those terms maybe for example, I don't know, male, female, like what
I,
would be
sorry, just jumping in there. I'm even thinking like cultural adaptation of disability communities. Maybe a lot of these resources are going to be person first, and that could offend a lot of people. Needs to be looked at and translated before it's being initially used. So it encompasses really everything in this aspect.
Yes, but like what you said, for this terms that disabled youth deem appropriate, terms that LGBTQIA deem appropriate, and same for Latinos. But we need people from these groups to help us do that,
Mm.
right? That we're responsible for incorporating individuals that identify with each group. And so we translate and adapt. We also give it that information or the curriculum that we've translated or adapted back to our stakeholders, individuals from this group, and we get feedback. We get the feedback, then we update the curriculum, the material again, and then we send it back and we get more feedback. And then we attempt to implement it. I can just imagine like a curriculum that is focused on disabled LGBTQIA, curriculum that is focused on Latino disabled youth. I can just see it now. And then staff and participant feedback post implementation. Then we see what we implemented, and we see what did the implementers think? What did the stakeholders think? After some time, was it effective? Another thing I wanted to go over was the categories, which is also significant in adaptation as well. This is ecological validity framework, which is used to guide what areas should be considered culturally sensitive for interventions and treatment. We have language, like what you said. What, Ricky, what type of language should we should be using? Verbal, written communication, maybe even the examples. Like in different books where there's Americanized examples. Can we make some examples that Latinos deem acceptable? Can we make some examples that LGBTQ disabled youth that deem acceptable? Persons as well as another dimension we need to be considering, which mentions like the family therapist relationship interactions.
I mean, this goes into what we were saying about the therapist coming from your culture in the work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Do we have that? Can we provide that? Can we be considered? Like, would you prefer one or another? Imagine if we could. That would be so nice. It's just like when you go to the doctor and they say, do you want a male doctor or you want a female doctor? If I had an option like, oh, do you want a female doctor who's also Latina? That would be nice. I would appreciate it. I might make a connection or feel a little more comfortable. So definitely persons we should be as another dimension to consider. Metaphors, cultural metaphors. I don't know if you have any metaphors that you can think of, but imagine if we had individualized metaphors. Like it would just be thoughtful, considerate. Yeah, the content as well. Cultural knowledge, values, customs, for the LGBTQIA group, for the Latino group as well, just how much more welcoming that content would be. Imagine if this was a sex education, how much more welcoming that sex education would be for this particular group, for that particular group. Can we can we promote comfort and openness to have this type of discussion surrounding sexual education? I can just imagine.
Mhm.
Yeah. Goals as well. Treatment goals created within that surround family values, customs, traditions for both groups, for all three groups, I would say, disabled, and for those who have intersections, and for those who identify as all three. Methods as well, the manner to which these goals are achieved. And finally, the context, like the socially, politically, economically, things are changing all the time. The context is changing all the time. Family context as well and dynamics are changing all the time. So these are some research reviewed ways that we can work on adapting, and something that maybe Ricky and I can envision maybe used in the future to adapt anything. Maybe we do more adapting, not just for these two groups. It's not limited to any specific group, but I think with this, it becomes kind of limitless,
Mhm.
if you just do the work.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay. Okay. That's what I wanted to say about that.
Cool.
Now, moving on to the recommendations, 5 recommendations for schools which allow sexual education. So the 5 recommendations for schools which allow sexual education programs, Decker et al. 2021 recommends. One, we include information about local clinics and services as part of required curricular content, addressing common concerns such as privacy, stigma, and access. There are there's few regulations as far as sexual education programs in schools. There's a lot of limitations surrounding that. Teachers are not exactly prepared to service these three groups or even the intersections of these three groups. So to have someone coming from the physician setting, the clinical setting, the actual place where these services are provided, for me, I think of like Planned Parenthood. Someone from Planned Parenthood shows up at a school and they're providing this information versus being prompting the teacher to provide this, just so that the information is accurate, real, coming from a professional physician or someone in that medical group, right? Two, recognizing the needs of youth that youth from these specific groups, LGBTQIA, Latino, disabled, those who are homeless in foster care, immigrant youth, first gen youth, that there probably will be cultural and community specific barriers, additional challenges that accessing services may be more limited.
Yep.
3, verifying the policies and services of local clinics, which additionally provide identity service and who are youth friendly as well. LGBTQIA plus individuals who are still trying to identify themselves, maybe exploring themselves, to have a friendly face in the medical field. Also, bridges that gap. Those who speak the language also bridge that gap. Medical professionals who are culturally responsive, if we
Mhm.
can find those and use those to do that type of relationship building would be amazing. 4, providing professional learning opportunities to teachers, administrators, staff would better serve as resources for youth, just the youth in general, right? Including youth from these three groups. That may mean workshops, that may mean social services, that may mean training at the state law and the federal law, policies surrounding adolescent rights and rights to sexual education. I can just see it now. 5, finally, for schools that do not have trained sexual health educators on staff, partnering with the local organization to ensure students receive accurate, inclusive, culturally appropriate information. So I'm glad that this stuff is out there. There is a concern for these groups, including Latinos and LGBTQIA. I'm so happy it's out there. It's how do we grow it? How do we disseminate it? Yeah, and this study, these 5 recommendations for school are not even focused on the disabled youth. So, but they did include LGBTQIA. They did include Latinos. They did include homeless. So taking these little pieces of research and you and I making this effort to try to synthesize how it could be delivered and include the disabled population, I think may explore may
Yep.
become be an exploratory thing that might do some good.
I mean, I think it's a good kind of wrapping this all up in a nice little bow. Although I have to say, with like all of these gaps and like there needs to be a lot more and stuff, I don't think we should wrap it up. We should leave it open so that people have this information and they can kind of do with it. But I think what you said, Elaine, is that there, I think many different individuals have to kind of like come to play here to make progress with this. Is that there is different groups that are doing different research and whatnot within these different contexts, but then can we bring it all together because it does intersect and it does the individuals, and we need to be kind of supporting it a little bit more. And that's exactly, at least for me, that's why we came here and presented this stuff. And like, yes, we don't have specific recommendations for everyone, and we don't have a specific study that we did yet
Yeah.
or things of that nature, but we just wanted to see what is out there and kind of present it to everybody and hopefully get your gears working a little bit and to critically think. So if you are a professional, you can go out there and utilize some of these tools or just even just think about it and being aware. Or if you're a family member watching this, just being aware, I think is the first step kind of in this direction. Is that we just need to be aware of these things, be aware of like what we're doing so that we can make a conscious effort.
And that it does not always have to be reactive. And there are other ways and other preventative ways to go about exploring sexuality and sexual education.
Mhm.
Everyone has the right to access sexual education. Everyone has a right to sexual identity. And I know we want to promote that within these specific groups because the research is missing. It's missing. And
Yep.
yeah, that's an injustice.
Yep.
That's right.
Hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
So here are our references. If you're interested, you can kind of read these articles and more. But we wanted to end it with just these are our emails. Elaine and I definitely have ideas and stuff of more things that we would like to do in this regard of this intersection of sex education and sexuality education for these different populations. We would love to hear from people. Maybe we missed something and we want to constantly learn and constantly grow and disseminate, but maybe you have a cool idea and let's network and work together and provide resources and support and things of that nature.
Any feedback is greatly appreciated.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening. Hope you got something out of this and we hope to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Take care.